Adrian Reeves had never been the kind of man to linger in quiet places, but that night was different. He found himself driving through the old park on the outskirts of the city, a place he hadn't visited in years. The streetlights barely worked, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. It was cold, the kind of cold that bit at your skin and sent shivers down your spine. His breath fogged up the car windows as he slowed down near the old swing set, a relic from a time when the park had been full of life and laughter. He almost didn't see the child. At first, Adrian thought it was a bundle of clothes someone had carelessly tossed aside, but something about it made him stop. He parked his car, leaving the engine running for warmth, and stepped out. The wind whipped through his coat, making him pull it tighter around himself as he walked closer. It wasn't a pile of clothes. It was a boy, no older than 5 or 6, huddled against the base of a tree, knees drawn to his chest. His tiny body trembled in the frigid air, his face streaked with tears. Adrian felt a strange pang in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years, not since the day he'd lost his own son. That pain had buried itself deep, hardening him against the world. He was a man who dealt in figures, in cold, logical decisions, but seeing the boy there, abandoned and alone, chipped away at something inside him. Adrian crouched down, trying to make his voice as gentle as he could, though it came out rough from disuse. "Hey, kid, what are you doing out here? Where's your family?" The boy didn't answer. His wide eyes stared up at Adrian, a mixture of fear and uncertainty. He was too cold to speak, too exhausted to cry anymore. Adrian's heart clenched at the sight. He didn't know what to do with children anymore. After all, he had built his empire, thrown himself into work to forget, to escape the crushing weight of the grief that had swallowed him whole years ago. But now, all of that was distant. This boy, he couldn't just leave him here. "Come on, let's get you out of the cold," Adrian said, his voice softer now. He reached out slowly, offering his hand. The boy hesitated, but then, as if sensing something in Adrian's gaze, he reached out with trembling fingers and took it. His small hand was freezing, a stark contrast to Adrian's warm, leather-gloved one. Adrian lifted the boy into his arms, surprised by how light he was. He felt as fragile as a bird, shivering uncontrollably. Adrian hurried back to his car, cradling the boy close to shield him from the wind. He opened the passenger door and gently set the child inside, blasting the heat as high as it would go. The boy curled up in the seat, still silent, but his eyes followed Adrian, filled with an unspoken plea for help. Adrian stood there for a moment, watching the boy. He had no idea what to do next. Calling the police seemed like the logical thing to do, but something stopped him. The boy wasn't wearing shoes, just a pair of thin socks, soaked through with mud and frost. His clothes were worn, a tattered sweater and pants that looked 2 sizes too big. Someone had left him here, deliberately. Who would do that? And why? He couldn't just leave the boy with the authorities, not until he knew more. Without another word, Adrian climbed back into the driver's seat and pulled away from the park, heading toward his home. The silence in the car was thick, but Adrian didn't force conversation. The boy needed warmth, food, and rest. Answers could come later. When they arrived at Adrian's house, he carried the boy inside. His home was large, a sprawling estate that felt too big for just him. It had been meant for a family, for a life that never came to be after tragedy struck. He set the boy down on the couch, draping a thick blanket over him before disappearing into the kitchen. Adrian wasn't used to taking care of anyone, but he managed to heat up some soup, the simplest thing he could think of. When he returned, the boy was sitting up, still bundled in the blanket, watching him with those same wide eyes. "What's your name?" Adrian asked, handing the boy the bowl of soup. The boy hesitated for a moment before speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sam." Adrian nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief that the boy had spoken. "Okay, Sam, you're safe now. We'll figure out what happened. Do you know where your parents are?" Sam shook his head slowly, his expression unreadable. Adrian's chest tightened again. What kind of parent could abandon their child like this? The thought angered him more than he expected. He had lost his son to something he couldn't control, a cruel twist of fate. But someone had made a conscious choice to leave this boy behind, and that was something Adrian couldn't comprehend. As Sam ate, Adrian sat across from him, thinking. He knew this was more than just a simple case of neglect. Something about this situation felt off. But without any more information, he was at a loss. He decided to call his lawyer in the morning, maybe even hire a private investigator. He couldn't just hand Sam over to child services without knowing more. Not until he was sure the boy wouldn't be hurt again. The night stretched on, and soon Sam fell asleep on the couch, curled up under the blanket. Adrian watched him for a long time, unable to tear his gaze away. The house, which had felt so empty for years, suddenly felt different, as if the boy's presence had brought it back to life. The silence wasn't as suffocating as it used to be. But beneath the calm, there was a growing tension. Whoever had left Sam behind wouldn't just disappear. Adrian had no idea what he was stepping into, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let this child go without a fight. Adrian woke early the next morning, his mind still heavy with the events of the previous night. The quiet hum of the house was broken only by the soft sound of Sam breathing on the couch. The boy hadn't stirred since falling asleep, his small frame curled up under the thick blanket. Adrian watched him for a moment, an odd mixture of emotions tugging at him. It had been so long since he'd had anyone else in the house, let alone a child. The silence that had once been his comfort now felt unsettling with this sudden, fragile life in his care. Adrian didn't know what to expect from the day ahead. Sam hadn't given him any real answers the night before, and he hadn't pushed. It didn't feel right to pry into the boy's pain when he was still reeling from whatever had happened to him. Adrian had hoped a night of sleep might help, but as Sam began to stir, blinking his eyes open to the unfamiliar surroundings, he looked just as lost as he had the night before. Adrian walked over slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Hey, kid, how are you feeling?" Sam sat up, clutching the blanket around his shoulders. He glanced around, his gaze darting to the large windows, the grand furniture, and the high ceilings. It was clear the boy had never been in a place like this before. His eyes finally settled on Adrian, but he didn't say anything. Adrian crouched down beside the couch, making sure his voice was calm, though inside he was bracing himself for whatever might come next. "You're safe here, Sam, but I need to know what happened. Can you tell me where you came from, or who left you there?" The boy's face tightened, and Adrian saw the fear flash through his eyes. Sam shook his head quickly, pulling the blanket tighter around himself, as if trying to make himself smaller, less visible. Adrian sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had dealt with high-stakes negotiations, with people who'd tried to cheat him out of millions, but this was something entirely different. He wasn't equipped for this, but looking at Sam, seeing the fear in his eyes, Adrian knew he couldn't back down. The boy needed him, even if neither of them knew what to do next. "I'm not going to force you," Adrian said, his voice softening. "But if there's anything at all you need to tell me, I'm here to help. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Sam didn't respond. Instead, he looked away, his gaze dropping to the floor. Adrian stood up, giving the boy some space. He wasn't going to push, not yet. There was something deeper going on here, something that would take time to uncover. The morning passed slowly. Adrian made breakfast, simple scrambled eggs and toast, and Sam ate in silence, his movements small and cautious. Every so often, Adrian would catch the boy glancing around, as if trying to make sense of where he was, trying to figure out if this was all some kind of strange dream. Adrian's phone buzzed on the counter, and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from his lawyer, confirming a meeting later in the day. Adrian had already made arrangements to discuss the situation, though he wasn't sure where to start. He hadn't even told his lawyer about the boy yet, just that something unexpected had come up. As the morning dragged on, Adrian debated his next move. He didn't want to involve the authorities just yet, not without knowing more. Sam was still a mystery, and the idea of handing him over to strangers without understanding what had happened didn't sit right with Adrian. He promised himself he wouldn't let the boy be hurt again, but what if involving others only made things worse? He sat down across from Sam, watching the boy play with the corner of the blanket. "Do you like dogs, Sam?" The question seemed to catch the boy off guard. He looked up, blinking in surprise. "Dogs?" Adrian nodded. "Yeah, I've got a dog. His name's Max. He's out back right now. Wanna meet him?" Sam hesitated, but after a moment, he nodded slowly. Adrian stood and led Sam through the house to the back door. When they stepped outside, Max, a large, friendly golden retriever, bounded over, his tail wagging furiously. The dog stopped short when he saw Sam, tilting his head as if confused by the boy's small size. Sam stiffened at first, but when Max nudged his hand with a wet nose, the boy's lips twitched in what might have been the start of a smile. Adrian watched as Sam tentatively reached out and patted the dog's head. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small step toward trust. They stayed outside for a while, Sam quietly petting Max while Adrian watched from a distance. It was the first time he'd seen the boy relax, even just a little. The wind had died down, and the sun was starting to break through the clouds, casting a pale light over the yard. When they finally went back inside, Sam seemed more at ease, though he still hadn't said much. Adrian knew this would take time, but he wasn't sure how much time they had. He needed answers, and he needed them soon. That afternoon, Adrian made his way to the lawyer's office, leaving Sam in the care of a trusted housekeeper. He didn't want to leave the boy, but this meeting was necessary. He needed to figure out what the next step was, legally and practically. The meeting with his lawyer was brief but informative. Adrian explained the situation, careful not to reveal too much about the boy's background, as he still didn't have all the facts. The lawyer listened carefully, then offered his advice. They could make temporary guardianship arrangements, but they needed to report the case to the authorities within the next few days. Adrian had expected that, but it didn't make him feel any better. There was no telling what kind of mess this could turn into once the system got involved. As he left the office, Adrian's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a private investigator he'd contacted earlier. The man had agreed to look into Sam's case discreetly. Adrian wasn't sure what they'd find, but something told him that the boy's past wasn't as simple as a lost child in the park. There were too many unanswered questions, too much fear in Sam's eyes. Someone had abandoned him deliberately, and Adrian was determined to find out why. When Adrian returned home, Sam was sitting at the kitchen table, coloring in a book the housekeeper had given him. The boy looked up when Adrian entered, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Trust, maybe, or hope. Adrian sat down across from him. "I'm going to help you, Sam. I promise." The boy didn't say anything, but he nodded slowly, as if he believed Adrian's words, even if he didn't fully understand them yet. That night, after Sam had gone to bed, Adrian stood by the window, staring out at the dark yard. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees. Something was coming. He could feel it. And when it did, he'd be ready. For now, all he could do was wait and protect the boy who had unexpectedly come into his life. But deep down, Adrian knew this was just the beginning. A week had passed, and in that time, Adrian found himself slipping into a routine that felt strangely natural, though it was a far cry from the life he'd known before. Sam had settled into the house, growing more comfortable in his presence, but the boy remained quiet and guarded, never volunteering much about his past. Adrian tried not to push too hard, but the lack of answers gnawed at him. Every night, he would sit by the fire after Sam had gone to bed, his mind racing with questions he didn't know how to answer. The private investigator, A man named Barrett had been digging into Sam's background, but so far, the results had been inconclusive. Barrett had managed to track down a few vague leads, rumors about a man matching the description of Sam's father, a drifter with a criminal history who had been seen around town. But no concrete evidence had surfaced, and Barrett warned Adrian that things could take a dark turn if they uncovered more. Adrian had become more attached to Sam than he ever expected. He hadn't planned for this. He hadn't planned for any of it. His life had been carefully constructed, layer by layer, to keep emotions at bay. Losing his own son years ago had been like falling into a bottomless pit, and he had clawed his way back to some semblance of normalcy through work, success, and the cold comfort of solitude. But Sam had changed all that. The boy had wormed his way into Adrian's heart, and now that he was there, Adrian couldn't imagine going back to the way things were before. It was during one of these quiet evenings, as Adrian sat by the fire, that his phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. He hesitated before answering, his gut telling him this call would change everything. "Mr. Reeves." The voice on the other end was deep and gruff, but steady. "My name's David. I believe you've been taking care of my son." Adrian's heart skipped a beat. He sat up straight, his grip tightening on the phone. "Sam's father." "That's right," David replied, his tone casual, as if they were discussing something trivial. "I've been away, but I'm back now. I'll be coming to get him tomorrow." Adrian felt a rush of anger flare up inside him. "You left him alone in a park." He was freezing, terrified. "You can't just come back, and—" "I had no choice," David interrupted, his voice hardening. "It's complicated, but I'm his father, and I'm coming to get him." Adrian's mind raced. This man, this so-called father, had abandoned Sam, left him in the cold to fend for himself, and now he thought he could just walk back into the boy's life. No, Adrian wasn't about to let that happen, not without a fight. "You can't just show up and expect to take him back like nothing happened," Adrian said, his voice low but firm. "He's been through hell, and I'm not going to let you put him through more." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a tense silence that made Adrian's skin prickle. Then David's voice came through, colder now, with an edge that sent a chill down Adrian's spine. "You don't know what you're getting into, Reeves. This isn't your fight. I'll be there tomorrow." The call ended abruptly, leaving Adrian staring at the phone in his hand, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he should have seen this coming. Nothing about Sam's situation was simple. But the idea of handing the boy over to a man who had so clearly failed him felt wrong on every level. Adrian wasn't a parent, not anymore. But in the short time Sam had been with him, he had felt something he hadn't in years, a fierce, protective instinct that he couldn't shake. The next morning, Adrian found himself pacing the living room, waiting for David to arrive. He had told Sam about the call, carefully, explaining that his father was coming to see him. Sam's reaction had been muted, his face pale and expressionless. It was as if the boy had shut down at the mention of his father, retreating into himself in a way Adrian hadn't seen since that first night. Sam didn't say much, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. When the knock came at the door, Adrian's heart was pounding in his chest. He opened it to find David standing on the front step, his presence dark and imposing. He was taller than Adrian expected, with a rugged face and eyes that seemed to hold secrets buried deep. His clothes were worn, and there was something about him that screamed trouble, though he tried to mask it with a thin veneer of civility. "You must be Adrian," David said, extending a hand, though there was no warmth in the gesture. Adrian ignored the outstretched hand, stepping aside to let him in. David's eyes swept over the house as he walked in, his gaze sharp and calculating. "Where's my boy?" David asked, glancing around the room as if Sam might be hiding somewhere. Adrian's voice was steady, but he felt the tension rising. "He's in his room. But before you see him, we need to talk." David smirked, crossing his arms as he leaned against the wall. "Talk about what, Reeves?" You've had him for a week. What, now you think you're his father? Adrian's fists clenched, but he kept his voice calm. I think I've done more for him in a week than you have in his whole life. He's been scared and confused, and you left him in a park. I need to know why. David's face darkened, his smirk fading. Like I said, it's complicated. I had business to take care of. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. Adrian's jaw tightened. Business. You call abandoning your child business? David pushed off the wall, his posture shifting as he squared up to Adrian. You don't know anything about me or what I've been through. You're just a rich guy playing hero, thinking you can swoop in and fix everything. But Sam's my blood. He's coming with me. Before Adrian could respond, Sam appeared in the doorway. The boy stood there, frozen, his eyes wide as he looked between the two men. For a long moment, none of them spoke. David's face softened slightly when he saw Sam. Hey, buddy, he said, his voice quieter now. It's me. I'm back. But Sam didn't move. He didn't run to his father, didn't smile or say anything. He just stood there, silent and small, his fear palpable. David's expression flickered with something. Disappointment, anger, maybe both. Adrian stepped forward, placing himself between Sam and David. He's not ready to go with you. David's eyes flashed with anger, but before he could speak, Sam's small voice broke the silence. I don't want to go. The words hung in the air like a weight. David's face hardened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. You don't mean that, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You're coming with me. Sam shook his head, his voice trembling but firm. I don't want to go. Adrian felt his heart swell with both pride and fear. He could see the storm brewing behind David's eyes, the rage building as his control slipped. You don't have a choice, David growled, stepping toward Sam. Adrian moved to block him, his voice steady but unyielding. He does have a choice, and right now, he's choosing to stay. David stared at Adrian, the tension crackling between them like a live wire. For a moment, it seemed like David might lash out, but then he backed off, his eyes narrowing as he pointed a finger at Adrian. This isn't over, Reeves. You're playing a dangerous game. With that, David turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Adrian stood there for a moment, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Sam was still behind him, silent and trembling. Adrian turned to the boy, kneeling down to his level. It's okay, Sam. He's gone. Sam didn't say anything, but he stepped forward, wrapping his small arms around Adrian's neck. It was the first time the boy had initiated contact, and the gesture was like a floodgate opening. Adrian held him tightly, his mind racing. He knew David wasn't done. The threat lingered in the air, thick and heavy. But for now, Sam was safe, and that was all that mattered. Adrian couldn't sleep that night. The tension from David's visit hung over the house like a storm cloud, dark and suffocating. Sam had fallen asleep in his room, exhausted from the emotional toll of the day, but Adrian's mind refused to settle. He paced through the house. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind outside, making his pulse quicken. David's threat was still ringing in his ears, and Adrian knew deep down that the man wasn't the type to give up easily. This wasn't over. Barrett, the private investigator, had warned Adrian that David had connections in shady circles. His past was littered with run-ins with the law, but nothing had ever stuck long enough to put him away. David was slippery, the kind of man who always seemed to stay one step ahead of trouble, but Adrian wasn't about to let him slip through again. Not when Sam's safety was at stake. The house, normally a place of comfort and solitude, now felt like a battleground. Adrian found himself constantly checking the locks, peering out the windows, half expecting David to return in the dead of night. His protective instincts were in overdrive, and though he tried to stay calm, the uncertainty gnawed at him. He wasn't sure what David's next move would be, but he knew it wouldn't be good. The next morning, after a restless few hours of sleep, Adrian made a decision. He couldn't wait for David to make the first move. He had to be proactive, to stay ahead of whatever game David was playing. Barrett had already gathered enough evidence to paint a clearer picture of David's history, but Adrian needed more. He needed something that would ensure Sam's safety permanently, something that would make it impossible for David to reclaim his son without facing consequences. Adrian's first call was to his lawyer, explaining the situation in more detail. The lawyer advised filing for emergency custody, a temporary measure that would give Adrian legal grounds to protect Sam while they figured out the next steps. It was a complicated process, but Adrian didn't care. He was willing to do whatever it took to keep Sam out of David's reach. While the paperwork was being prepared, Adrian met with Barrett again. This time, the investigator had more troubling news. David's recent activities had been erratic, to say the least. He had been seen meeting with some unsavory characters in the city's underbelly, people with criminal records much worse than his own. There were rumors that David owed money to dangerous people, and that Sam had been a bargaining chip in some kind of deal gone wrong. The revelation sent a cold chill down Adrian's spine. If David had abandoned Sam to protect himself from these people, it meant that Sam had been in far more danger than Adrian had initially realized. And if David's debts weren't settled, those same people could still be looking for leverage. Leverage in the form of a scared little boy. Barrett suggested upping security around the house, and Adrian agreed without hesitation. Cameras were installed around the perimeter, and a private security team was hired to keep watch discreetly. Adrian didn't want to alarm Sam, but he knew he couldn't take any chances. The boy had already been through enough, and the last thing Adrian wanted was for him to feel unsafe in the one place he should be able to find peace. Days passed in a tense limbo, each one stretching longer than the last. Sam seemed to sense the unease in the house, though he didn't ask any questions. He spent most of his time quietly playing with Max or drawing in a sketchbook Adrian had bought him. The boy's resilience amazed Adrian. Despite everything, Sam carried himself with a quiet strength that Adrian couldn't quite comprehend. He had seen adults break under far less, but Sam was still standing, still holding on. Then one night, everything changed. Adrian had just finished a late-night call with his lawyer when the security system beeped, a single sharp alert that sent his heart racing. He checked the monitor, expecting to see nothing more than a stray animal triggering the motion sensors, but what he saw instead made his blood run cold. A figure was standing at the edge of the property, just out of range of the lights. It was David. Adrian's first instinct was to call the police, but he hesitated. Something about David's posture, the way he stood there, motionless, watching the house, sent a shiver down Adrian's spine. He wasn't acting like a man who had come to barge in and take what he wanted. There was something else in his stance, something desperate. Against his better judgment, Adrian decided to confront him. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at his skin. The security team was close by, watching from a distance, but Adrian waved them off. He needed to see what David wanted, face to face. As Adrian approached, David didn't move. His face was gaunt, more so than before, and there was a wildness in his eyes that hadn't been there during their last encounter. It was the look of a man who had run out of options. "What are you doing here, David?" Adrian asked, keeping his voice steady. David's lips twitched into a grimace. "I don't have anywhere else to go." Adrian narrowed his eyes, staying cautious. "You need to stay away from Sam. He doesn't want to see you." David let out a bitter laugh, his breath fogging in the cold air. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't know what I've done?" He paused, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "I didn't come here to take him. I came because they're coming for me." Adrian's stomach twisted. "Who's coming?" David's eyes flicked to the shadows beyond the trees, his paranoia seeping through every word. "The people I owe. The people who wanted Sam. They're not going to stop. They think I still have him." Adrian's mind raced. This was worse than he had imagined. David wasn't just a bad father, he was a marked man. And now those marks were circling closer, thinking that Sam was still a pawn in whatever game David had been playing. "They're going to come for him," David said, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. "And when they do, they won't leave empty-handed." Adrian's pulse quickened. "You need to leave. If you stay here, you're only putting Sam in more danger." David's face twisted in anguish. "Don't you think I know that? I came here to warn you, to make sure you knew what was coming. I'm not here to take him, I swear." For the first time, Adrian saw something in David's eyes that looked like remorse. But it was too late for that. The damage had been done, and now they were all caught in the crossfire of David's mistakes. "You need to go," Adrian said again, his voice hard. "Before you make this worse." David nodded, his face pale in the moonlight. "I'll leave, but if they come, if something happens, tell Sam I didn't want this." With that, David turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Adrian standing alone in the cold, his mind spinning with the weight of what had just happened. The threat was closer than ever, and now it wasn't just David he had to worry about. As Adrian walked back to the house, the reality of the situation hit him like a wave. This wasn't just a custody battle. This was a fight for survival, for Sam's safety, for everything he had come to care about. And Adrian knew, deep down, that the worst was yet to come. The days after David's warning were suffocating. Every creak in the house, every flicker of movement on the security cameras sent Adrian's heart racing. The constant surveillance was meant to provide protection, but it only served to highlight just how vulnerable they were. The sense of dread hung over everything, thick and oppressive. Even Sam, who had been growing more comfortable, seemed to feel the tension, his quiet demeanor now tinged with a nervousness that hadn't been there before. Adrian tried to keep things as normal as possible for the boy, but it was nearly impossible. Every time the phone rang, his stomach tightened, wondering if it was the news he feared most. Barrett had continued his investigation, but even he seemed worried now. The more they learned about David's past, the clearer it became that the people coming after him weren't just looking to collect a debt. They were dangerous, the kind of men who operated outside the law, ruthless and without hesitation. Adrian had considered fleeing, taking Sam and disappearing somewhere far away, where they couldn't be found. But running felt like admitting defeat, and there was no guarantee they wouldn't be found. Plus, the legal system was already in motion. The emergency custody filing was progressing, and his lawyer advised against making any sudden moves that could jeopardize the case. Adrian had built his entire life on facing challenges head-on, and he wasn't about to let these people scare him into a corner. But deep down, he knew that this wasn't a battle he could fight with lawyers and court orders. One evening, as Adrian sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, trying to sort through his thoughts, Sam walked in, his small figure casting a shadow in the dim light. The boy had been quieter than usual, but now there was a look in his eyes that Adrian hadn't seen before, something between fear and resolve. "Adrian." Sam's voice was barely above a whisper. Adrian set down his cup and looked at the boy. "Yeah, kid." Sam hesitated, twisting his fingers nervously before speaking. Are they going to come for me?" Adrian's chest tightened. He had tried so hard to shield Sam from the worst of it, but the boy was smart. He picked up on the tension, the extra security, the late-night phone calls. Adrian had no choice but to be honest, at least as much as he could be. "I won't let anyone hurt you, Sam," Adrian said, his voice firm. "You're safe here. I promise." Sam looked down at the floor, his small shoulders hunched. "But my dad, he said they were bad people." Adrian felt a surge of anger toward David for burdening his son with that fear, but he swallowed it down, forcing himself to stay calm. "Your dad, he's made some bad choices, Sam, but that's not your fault. None of this is your fault." Sam was silent for a long moment, and then he looked up at Adrian with wide, innocent eyes. "What if they come here? What if they hurt you?" The question cut through Adrian like a knife. He hadn't thought about that, about what would happen if something went wrong, if he couldn't protect them both. But he couldn't let Sam see his fear. The boy needed reassurance, not more reasons to be afraid. "They won't," Adrian said, though the words felt hollow. "I've made sure we're safe. There are people watching out for us. And I'll do everything I can to make sure nothing happens." Sam nodded, but the worry in his eyes didn't fade. He lingered for a moment longer before retreating to his room, leaving Adrian alone with his thoughts. The house felt colder, emptier in the silence that followed. Later that night, after Sam had gone to bed, Adrian found himself staring at the security monitors again, his nerves stretched thin. The motion detectors picked up every gust of wind, every flicker of movement in the shadows, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Still, Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Then, just past midnight, the alarm system blared, shattering the quiet. Adrian's heart leaped into his throat as he rushed to the security monitor. On the screen, figures were moving through the darkness, creeping along the edge of the property. They were dressed in black, their faces obscured by masks. There were at least 3 of them, maybe more. Adrian's blood ran cold. The men had arrived. For a moment, Adrian froze, his mind racing. He had prepared for this, but now that it was happening, the reality of the danger hit him like a freight train. He grabbed his phone and quickly dialed the police, his voice low and urgent as he reported the intruders. They assured him that officers were on their way, but Adrian knew it might be too late by the time they arrived. His next thought was Sam. The boy was still asleep, oblivious to the threat creeping closer. Adrian moved quickly, heading to Sam's room and shaking him awake. Sam blinked groggily, confused, but Adrian's urgency pulled him out of his haze. "Sam, we have to go," Adrian whispered, trying to keep his voice calm even though his heart was pounding. "Right now." Sam didn't ask questions. He scrambled out of bed, his fear returning in full force as he sensed the gravity of the situation. Adrian grabbed a jacket for the boy and ushered him toward the back door, where he hoped they could slip away unnoticed. The security team had already been alerted, and they were moving to intercept the intruders, but Adrian couldn't rely on them to keep Sam safe. Not now. They moved quickly through the house, the sounds of footsteps outside growing louder. Adrian's mind raced, calculating their next move. The back door led to a small wooded area behind the house. If they could make it there, they might be able to hide until the police arrived. But as they reached the door, a loud crash echoed from the front of the house. The intruders had broken in. Adrian's adrenaline surged. There was no time to think, only to act. He pulled Sam close, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "Stay with me, Sam. We're going to be okay." They slipped out the back door, the cold night air hitting them like a slap. Adrian led Sam into the trees, the shadows swallowing them up as they ran. Behind them, the sounds of shouts and breaking glass filled the air. But Adrian kept moving, his grip on Sam's hand tight. They ran until Adrian's lungs burned, weaving through the trees as the sounds of chaos faded into the distance. When they finally stopped, hidden deep in the woods, Adrian crouched down beside Sam, pulling him close. The boy was shaking, his small body trembling with fear, but he clung to Adrian, trusting him completely. Adrian's mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. He had no idea if the intruders were still searching for them, or if the security team had managed to stop them. But one thing was clear: this wasn't going to end tonight. David's enemies had come for Sam, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. The police arrived not long after, their flashing lights cutting through the trees as they searched the property. Adrian and Sam stayed hidden until it was safe, until the officers had swept the house and apprehended the men who had broken in. It had been close, too close. As they emerged from the woods, Sam clung to Adrian's side, his wide eyes scanning the police cars and officers moving through the scene. Adrian's heart ached for the boy, for the fear and confusion that had been thrust upon him by a world he didn't understand. But as he looked down at Sam, he knew one thing for certain. He would protect this boy, no matter what. The threat wasn't over, but neither was Adrian's resolve. The following days passed in a blur of police interviews, security upgrades, and sleepless nights. Adrian did everything in his power to make sure Sam was shielded from the chaos. But even with the intruders caught and locked up, there was a persistent sense of unease hanging in the air. The men who had broken into his home were part of something much larger, a criminal network that David had somehow gotten tangled up with, and Adrian knew that just locking them up wasn't going to end the threat. Sam had been quiet since the night of the break-in, his usual curiosity replaced with a watchful silence. He rarely left Adrian's side, and the trust that had taken weeks to build was now threaded with fear. Adrian saw it in the way Sam flinched at sudden noises or hesitated before walking into a room. It tore at Adrian's heart, knowing that this boy, who had already been through so much, was now burdened with even more trauma. The police had promised increased patrols in the area, and Barrett had doubled the security detail around the house, but Adrian still didn't feel safe. He had spoken to his lawyer about speeding up the custody process, hoping that making his guardianship over Sam official would give him more leverage. But the wheels of the legal system turned slowly. It could be months before they had any concrete resolution, and Adrian wasn't sure they had that kind of time. Then came the unexpected news that shook everything. Barrett, who had continued digging into David's past, called Adrian late one evening with a revelation that felt like a punch to the gut. It turned out that David hadn't just gotten himself into trouble with some low-level thugs. He had been involved in a major criminal operation, one that stretched across state lines and involved everything from drug trafficking to human smuggling. The men who had broken into Adrian's house weren't just after money or revenge. They believed that Sam held some kind of key to unlocking the information they needed to find something or someone David had hidden before he disappeared. Barrett's voice was grim as he explained the situation. They think David left a trail, something that only Sam can lead them to. That's why they want him. They won't stop coming, Adrian, not until they find what they're looking for. Adrian felt the weight of the revelation hit him like a ton of bricks. Sam had no idea what these men wanted, and Adrian was certain the boy wasn't hiding anything. But that didn't matter to the people hunting them. As far as they were concerned, Sam was the key to unlocking a treasure trove of criminal secrets, and they would stop at nothing to get their hands on him. For the first time since all of this had started, Adrian seriously considered fleeing. Running away had never been in his nature, but this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about protecting Sam, and if that meant disappearing to keep him safe, so be it. But then Sam came to him one evening, standing at the doorway of Adrian's office, clutching the sketchbook he had been drawing in since he arrived. His small voice broke through Adrian's swirling thoughts. Adrian. Adrian looked up from his desk, the weight of everything momentarily forgotten as he met Sam's wide, uncertain eyes. "What's up, kid?" Sam hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edges of the sketchbook. I don't want to be scared anymore." The simple statement hit Adrian harder than any of the threats or revelations he'd faced. Sam wasn't asking for a way out, wasn't looking for an escape. He just wanted the fear to stop. And Adrian, who had built an entire life around protecting himself from loss, realized that running away wouldn't make the fear go away. It would only postpone it. They had to face this together, head on. That night, Adrian made a decision. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to let the men chasing David's shadow dictate their lives any longer. He'd spent years learning how to navigate complex business deals, outmaneuvering ruthless competitors, and building an empire from nothing. This was just another battle, one that required all of his cunning and determination. And this time, it wasn't about money or power. It was about Sam's life. The next morning, Adrian met with Barrett and his security team, laying out a plan. If the criminals believed that Sam had the information they needed, Then Adrian would make sure they got the message loud and clear. Sam wasn't going to be their pawn. He arranged for more visible security measures around the house, making it clear that any further attempts would be met with overwhelming force. But more importantly, Adrian started digging deeper into David's criminal ties, using every resource at his disposal to find out exactly what these men were after. He wasn't just going to wait for them to strike again. He was going to take the fight to them. As the weeks passed, the tension began to ease, but the danger still loomed in the background. Adrian continued to push forward with the custody process, working with his lawyer to ensure that when the time came, Sam would officially be his son. The bond between them had only grown stronger, and though Sam still had moments of fear, he was beginning to trust that Adrian would keep him safe. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Sam curled up on the couch with Max. Adrian looked over at the boy who had come to mean so much to him in such a short time. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, Adrian felt a sense of peace. He wasn't just protecting Sam anymore. He was building a future for them both, one where fear wouldn't rule their lives. And then, in a twist that Adrian never saw coming, David reappeared. It was late at night when the knock came at the door. Adrian had been expecting another routine security check, or perhaps a late delivery, but when he opened the door, David stood there, ragged and beaten, his face hollow with exhaustion. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their shared history hanging between them like a cloud. "I need to talk to you," David said, his voice broken. Adrian wanted to slam the door in his face, to tell him to leave and never come back. But something in David's eyes, the desperation, the guilt, stopped him. Against his better judgment, Adrian stepped aside and let him in. David collapsed into a chair, his hands shaking as he rubbed his face. "They won't stop," he muttered, more to himself than to Adrian. "They're going to keep coming. I thought I could handle it, but I can't. I can't protect him." Adrian crossed his arms, his eyes hard. "Why did you come back? You made this mess. You abandoned Sam, and now you've put him in danger. You have no right to ask for anything." David looked up, his face pale and gaunt. I know I've screwed up, but I need your help. You're the only one who can keep him safe now." Adrian's fists clenched. He had spent weeks trying to clean up David's mess, and now the man had the nerve to ask for his help. But as much as Adrian wanted to tell him to leave, he couldn't ignore the truth. David wasn't here for himself. He was here for Sam. "What do you want from me, David?" Adrian asked, his voice low. David swallowed hard, his eyes filled with regret. "Let me fix this. Let me help you stop them. I'll disappear after that, I swear. But I need to make sure Sam is safe." For a long moment, Adrian didn't respond. The anger, the resentment, the desire to protect Sam from everything David had brought into their lives, it all clashed in his mind. But in the end, one thing was clear. Sam's safety came first, no matter what. "You help me stop them," Adrian said slowly, his eyes locked on David's. "And then you're out of our lives. For good." David nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Deal." And so, with an uneasy truce, Adrian and David joined forces. Together, they tracked down the criminals who had been after Sam, using David's insider knowledge and Adrian's resources to outmaneuver them at every turn. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when everything seemed on the brink of collapse. But in the end, they succeeded. The men who had threatened Sam were taken down, arrested in a coordinated effort with the police and Barrett's security team. And true to his word, David disappeared after it was over, leaving Sam in Adrian's care without a fight. Months later, as the adoption papers were finalized and Adrian became Sam's legal guardian, the house that had once been a place of isolation and grief became a home filled with warmth and laughter. Adrian had never expected to find family again, but in Sam, he had found more than just a son. He had found hope, redemption, and a reason to keep fighting. The road hadn't been easy, but they had faced it together. And as they sat by the fire one evening, Sam's head resting on Adrian's shoulder, the shadows of the past finally seemed to fade, leaving only the bright promise of a future they would build together.